So many of us do what we do because of some of the seminal work that Jamie Pennebaker has done, and we've been inspired to look at words and how words relate to various psychological properties. So just to give a very brief intro, Jamie Pennebaker is the Regents Centennial Professor of Psychology at the University of Texas at Austin. His research focuses on the relationship between natural language use, health, and social behavior, and essentially how everyday language reflects basic social and personality processes. Thank you. His cross-disciplinary research is related to linguistics, clinical and cognitive psychology, communications, medicine, and computer science. He has written 9 books, including The Secret Life of Pronouns, What Our Words Say About Us. This is a book that I use in one of my classes, and all the students absolutely love it. And also Opening Up, The Healing Power of Expressing Emotions, in addition to over 250 articles. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jamie Pennebaker.
It's a real joy to be here, and this place is amazing. I feel like a movie star. Well, it is Los Angeles. Can you hear me all right without a microphone? Okay. I wanted today to talk to you about kind of the research I'm doing now, but put it in the context of what I've done in the past. Where we're going is I'm interested in the nature of words and how they express who we are, and how we can harness this knowledge to better bring about changes in behavior. And some of the work is specifically related to the nature of education. And I'll be giving a talk tomorrow at ICT at some time. No telling. Which will be dealing with the education work that I'm doing. So a little bit of background. I was trained as a social psychologist. I'm the kind of person who has never been in a particular home very well because my interests, I have a short attention span, so I bounce around from topic to topic. My early work all dealt with the mind-body problem, and I was interested in kind of the relationship between biological change and how people perceive that change. And I was interested in the nature of physical symptoms. Who reports physical symptoms? Why do they report physical symptoms? And I'd been doing research in this area for several years when it occurred to me, maybe I should come up with just a big questionnaire and ask people about their lives to see if there may be some features of their lives that may be related to physical symptom reporting. And it was beyond personality, it was beyond traditional social. And what I did was essentially got together with a group of my students and said, okay, we are going to ask whatever we want of several hundred students with this questionnaire. So it ended up being a 12-page questionnaire, and it was the questions, we started off with, what kind of foods do you like? How do you eat? What's your relationship between your family and how you eat? How do you get along with your mother? How do you get along with your father? And this went on and on. And finally, one of the students said, how about this one? Prior to the age of 17, did you ever have a traumatic sexual experience? Sure. So we stuck that one on as well. Passed it out to 800 students. Came back, and that one question about a sexual trauma was related to every health question we had. We later were involved in a national sample. It was not a random sample, but this was part of Psychology Today, got this weird sample of about 24,000 people, much older sample. And what we found there, which was later was found to be, we got similar results, or other research teams found similar results with good samples, was that people who reported having traumatic sexual experience in childhood were twice as likely to have been hospitalized in the last year for any cause. They were more likely to have been diagnosed with cancer, high blood pressure, ulcers, colds, flus, basically everything. And I started to wonder, what is it about a traumatic sexual experience that's so toxic? And it could be something sexual. It could also be something that goes along with it, because one thing that we started discovering was most people who had had a traumatic sexual experience had never really talked with other people about it. Maybe it was the secrecy feature of this. So we did some more questionnaires working in large companies. And we had one sample of about 600 people, and we asked them these questions about traumatic sexual experience and other traumas. And we also asked, to what degree did you talk to others about it? And what we discovered was it didn't matter what the trauma was, but if you kept it secret, you were much more likely to have health problems than if you didn't keep it secret. Now, you all, I hope you're sitting there thinking, well, that's correlational, blah, 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 yeah, I know. So, the question I became interested in is, if secrets are so toxic, what if we brought people in the laboratory and had them somehow express these, maybe talking about them, writing about them, and we decided to go with writing just because it was easier. So we ended up doing a study, and this was a study I really did on, it was a speculative study, where we brought people in the laboratory and randomly assigned them to write about, and I'm going to simplify the study, two primary things. One was to write about their deepest thoughts and feelings about the most traumatic experience of their life, ideally something that they haven't talked to other people about. And in another condition, to have them write about superficial topics. And what we found was that, and we also got permission from these students to access their student health records. This was done at SMU, which is in many ways related to USC, private college, majority of students not from the area. And a student health center right smack dab next to the dorms, which, by the way, if you're doing this research, is exactly where you want them, because the closer students are to a health center, the more often they go. There's some great data on that as well. In any case, we had these people write for 4 days, 15 minutes a day, and in that first study, we found that writing about a traumatic experience was associated with people going to the student health center at about half the rates as people in the control conditions. And we later replicated this getting immune markers, and then this project in our lab and other labs started to spread. It's interesting that Arthur Stone's here because he was one of the first people who both replicated it and didn't replicate it. And initially he was saying, well, there's some problems here, and it's true, there were some problems there. But his lab eventually ended up demonstrating the same kind of phenomenon over and over again. Now, what ended up being in dispute, and it's now, almost 30 years later, still in dispute, is why in the world does this work? What is it about putting traumatic experiences into words that make a difference? Now, the bottom line answer to this, and it's as you stand back and look at all of this work, and in fact, as a side note, I have a revision of my book, Opening Up, coming out, and the co-author of this is Joshua Smythe, one of Arthur's students actually, where we went back, we've looked at all of these studies. There have now been hundreds of studies on expressive writing. And the overall effect size are modest. If you're going to stand back, it's probably a D of about a 0.16, which if you're a lab researcher, you think, that's not science. 0.16, that's pathetic. But if you deal with real world data, 0.16 is actually a fairly sizable effect size if you're looking at health changes over several weeks or months. Nevertheless, what causes it, if you look at all the data, it's a whole cascade of effects or phenomena that are driving it. Merely putting the experience into words, the mere labeling, there's some research that suggests that is really critical. Another is that putting things into words and in some kind of narrative makes a big difference in helping to organize the experience. Another is by doing that, individuals stop ruminating about as much and they sleep better. And there have now been several studies of expressive writing and sleep. And as many of you know, the world of sleep is really compelling in that we know that it's associated with immune change, it's associated with health change, and so forth. There have been some very interesting studies showing that expressive writing is associated with greater working memory, or some would say frontal lobe function or executive function. And that what you find is when people write, that these various markers of working memory show greater working memory. And one other thing that has been found is that it's also associated with when people write about these traumatic experiences, they end up talking more with others, becoming more socially engaged over the next several months. And these are some studies where you give people a device which we call the ear. It's an electronically activated recorder. It's now essentially a cell phone with a lapel mic that comes on for 30 seconds and goes off for 12 minutes. We have people wear this for a couple of days prior to being assigned to condition, and then about a month after writing, we have them wear it again. And what's interesting is we find that writing about these traumatic experiences is associated with more social engagement. And ironically, it's unrelated to self-reports of engagement. And I think one reason is that self-reports are really tapping people's self-theories of their social behaviors, which isn't necessarily related to their actual behaviors. That's not what I'm here to talk about. I'm not even here to talk about expressive writing. The only reason I'm telling you that is that's what led me into what I'm doing now. As we were going through various studies, trying to figure out why writing worked, after about 2 or 3 years, it occurred to me, hey, maybe I should read what these people are writing. Maybe there's some clue to these experiences. And I started off doing what anybody here would do initially, which was, I got a bunch of writing samples, some from people who benefited, some who didn't, called one group X, the other group Y, and we gave these essays to clinical psychologists or students who are in a clinical program, asking, what's the difference between group X and Y? Didn't see much. Then we got another group of people to rate each essay in terms of how emotional, how is this person finding value, is this person finding truth, is this a good story, whatever. And what all of these essay projects and judge projects did was prove to us, first of all, judges don't agree on anything. Secondly, the system is really slow and horribly expensive. And third, when you have people read deeply, horrifyingly depressing essays, they get depressed. And so we were practically doing therapy on the people who were doing it, judging our thing. So I needed something else, and it occurred to me, why not a computer to analyze the text? And this was the early 90s. There was no commercial program available, and so I decided to go ahead and write one myself, because many years earlier I had taken a course in Fortran and figured, how hard could it be? Well, it turned out it was really hard. And I had a graduate student at the time, Martha Francis, whose undergraduate degree had been in computer science, and she was actually the one who wrote it. The hard part of it was coming up with a way to identify how we wanted the program to work. And it occurred to me that just a stupid, simple word counting program would work. So we could go through and count the number of words, let's say, that were anger words or happy words or whatever kind of words. But to do that, you had to tell the computer what words to look for. And that was the hard part. So we got groups of judges. And this judging process took about 3 years, where we get groups of judges agreeing. Okay, is this an anger word? What about this one? What about this one? And so that was the general process. And we started off with what it turns out everybody who writes a computer program always does this first, is they do emotion words. So anger, sad, anxiety, etc., certain groups of emotion words. But as long as you're doing that, I wanted to get some other kinds of words, so we got some cognitive words, words like causal words, because, cause, effect, or what we call insight words, understand, realize, know, meaning. And as long as we're doing it, you start adding more and more dimensions. So we added parts of speech, like pronouns, different types of pronouns, and articles and prepositions, and so forth. So the original program is called Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count, LIWC, or LUC as we call it. And the LUC program, initially we had about 60 dimensions, and it went through major revisions, and we've just come up with the most recent revision is last year. It's a pretty slick program in that it goes through and it calculates the percentage of words that are in each of these categories, and it allows you now to compare one writing sample with another and so forth. So we went, when this was now in the mid-90s, we started to go back to some of our old expressive writing studies and some expressive writing studies that other labs had done. Try to identify, are there certain linguistic features that predict health improvement? And what we found was that there were, and the effects were modest. And the first study found that the more that people used positive emotion words while writing about horrible things, that was associated with health improvements. Negative emotion words, not so much. And the effect size for positive emotion words was very small. And it's kind of ironic. So if people are writing about horrible traumatic experiences, and they can use words like happy, joy, love, even if they say, I'm not happy, there's no joy in the world, nobody loves me, that person is much better off than someone who says they're sad and miserable. Because if you look at, if I'm not happy, being not happy means I'm still seeing the world along the dimension of happiness, which is a very different concept than feeling sad. Or someone who's not sad is much worse off than someone who doesn't say anything about sadness. Now, there was another dimension that we found to be far stronger in its relationship, and these were cognitive words, these words like causal words and insight words. And what was interesting there was it wasn't just a base rate, but rather people who went from using a very low level of these cognitive words to a high level, those people showed health improvements. Those people, though, who stayed at the same rate over the course of their writing, by and large, didn't improve. And in fact, this idea of a story changing turned out to be a really powerful one with some other analyses we did as well. And our next kind of analyses, we used a method that's called latent semantic analysis, LSA. And LSA was really designed to look at content of what people are writing. But what we discovered was that didn't predict anything. So what we did with LSA is what most text analytic people do in the LSA world is they start off by throwing out what they call stop words. Stop words are words like pronouns, prepositions, articles. They're the most common words in English. There's about 600 that they throw out. Well, what we did was we threw out all the content words and just left in the stop words, and we did LSA, which is a glorified factor analysis of words. And we discovered it predicted health improvement. And when we boiled it down, did these analyses in multiple ways over multiple studies, what we discovered was that people who changed in their use of pronouns, specifically oscillating between first-person singular pronouns versus other pronouns, those people benefited a lot. And it didn't. So some days they'd be focusing a lot on self. The next day of writing, they might be focusing on others and other people. And so this perspective switching, and it's not unlike what you see in what a good clinical psychologist does. If you have a client and the client comes in and you ask the client what the problem is, the client might say, oh, I'm here because I'm having a problem with my wife, I'm feeling this, I'm feeling that, I'm feeling this. And a good therapist at some point will say, stop just a bit. What about your wife? What's going on with your wife? Or if the person comes in and says, well, my wife, she does this, she does that, she does this, the therapist says, stop. How about you? What are you feeling? That in fact, people who are switching back and forth, it's forcing them to think differently. Now, this discovery was actually quite profound because at the same time that I was playing with these studies, I was also, this was at the kind of the beginning of the internet revolution. So every night I'd go home and I was downloading files. And one of the things I was really excited about, this speaks to people of a certain age and older, was America Online, AOL. For some of the people in this room, you probably just feel all warm and fuzzy remembering the first AOL days, because what America Online did was they had these public chat rooms. And they were really quite remarkable. Everything from the usual perverse sex rooms, but also there would be groups to talk about sports or religion or whatever. And what I would do every night is I'd go and I'd just start downloading different groups. And then I'd go through and start analyzing differences. And one of the things I discovered right away was that a lot of the dimensions I thought would be important didn't show much. But a lot of things started coming out that made no sense. And the big differences I found were with really small words like pronouns and articles and prepositions. And one of the big differences I found were the differences between men and women. And I'm not going to do a quiz that I do everywhere. Who did I just make look like fools? Oh, I remember Carnegie Mellon. I'm not going to do, because I don't have enough time for this talk, and I know you all would get all of these right, but what I often will ask groups is who uses the following words more, men or women? So first person singular, I, me, and my, who uses that more? Most of you would say men, and you'd be wrong. Who uses we, us, and our more? Most of you would say women, and you'd be wrong. But it turns out men and women don't use, they use them at the same rates. Articles, a, n, and the, you have no idea, but you would guess, interestingly, women, and you would be wrong. Emotion words, you will guess women, you would be wrong. Who uses cognitive words, because, cause, effect, reason, rationale? You would guess men, and you would be wrong. And then I ask about social words, he, she, they, etc., and you say women, and I'd say, thank God you finally got one right. Now here is where you would have gone wrong, except you guys I know would have actually done very well. And it's interesting, linguistics departments do as bad or worse as psychology, computer science, etc. So these are culturally held beliefs, and I've done this in other countries, other languages, and these same-sex differences exist linguistically. Why is this? Well, it's because these words tell us about who people are. I words, you think, well, how can it be that men surely use I words more because they're more arrogant and self-centered? They may be arrogant and self-centered, but they don't use I words more. I words don't reflect arrogance. They reflect self-focus. That an individual who is self-focused uses I words more. A person who is depressed, who is in physical pain, is self-focused. They use those words more than people who are not depressed, who are not self-focused, and so forth. Now, I was on a flight about this time, and I came across this book that was by George Miller called The Science of Words. It was published in 1995. And I don't know how I happened to get it, but I was on this flight, and I started reading it, and all of a sudden, it was this aha experience. Because in it, he makes a distinction between what he called content words and function words. Now, a content word is really a noun, regular verb, adjective, and most adverbs. These content words account for about 99.5% of all the words in our vocabulary. They are the whole purpose language evolved. They are, that's what education is learn, transmitting concepts. So we had, or earlier, if we're in a cave somewhere, it's important to know if there's a lion outside the cave as opposed to a rabbit. Having nouns and regular verbs is really good. But these words, even though that they are, there's a lot of them, we don't use any of them. We don't use any particular nouns or regular verbs at high rates. Because we don't have that, the average person here has a vocabulary of somewhere between 50 and 100,000 words, that doesn't allow usage of many of these. The rest of the words are these small groups of words called function words. And function words include pronouns, prepositions, to, for, of, things like that, articles, a, and the, auxiliary verbs, is, am, have, negations, no, not, never, selected adverbs that don't have a direct referent, like so, very, really, things like that. Now, what's interesting about these function words is we know with brain damage that if you have brain damage to the frontal lobe, individuals don't use function words much. In fact, they are more likely to use nouns and regular verbs. And damage to, say, Wernicke's area is associated with something referred to as a word salad. Am I right about this? Yes. Okay, so I want to make sure. And this word salad, if you listen to it, is all function words. Now, what's interesting about this is function words account for about 60 to 65% of all the words we say, hear, read, etc. In other words, these words are everywhere, and in English, there's only about 180 really common ones. There's probably 500 in total, but about 180 of these words account for most of the things that we say. Now, there's another thing that's interesting about them, is they are very, very much social words. Imagine you come in here and there's piece of paper on the ground, and it says, it may have blown in from the outside, it says, "I'm not here, I'll be right back." Now, on one level, that makes sense, and on another level, it makes no sense at all. I, who's I? Am. Am implies present tense. When was it written? Not here. Was this paper here? Was this refers here? All of those words were words that were written by a person intended for a particular audience at a particular time. And if I found that author and took that note to the author 2 years from now and say, "What does this mean?" the author very likely would say, "I have no idea." Now, this is where things start to get interesting, because as you start looking at function words, we start to get a sense of the person, and the person who's using them, and the person's relationship to the topic, and the person's relationship to the person with whom they're conversing. To give you an example of how we can start thinking about function words. My computer program, with your generous permission, will allow me to go in and analyze everybody's emails. And if I did that, what I could do is I could look at your emails that you sent out over the last month, and one thing I could count immediately would be the percentage of words that are social words, reference to other people, he, she, they, etc. I can almost guarantee you this. People who use these words at high rates care about other people. They are more socially engaged. And people who use these at very low rates just don't care about people very much. It's not that they hate them. In fact, it's probably they just don't matter. They're not top of their hierarchy. The words we use, whether pronouns, articles, prepositions, tell us where people are paying attention. Now, I noted that men and women differ in the use of I words, but they also differ in terms of social words and articles. Articles, men use articles at much higher rates than women. Why is that? Because articles are used before concrete objects and things. Women don't talk about articles or objects and things as much as men do. Women, statistically, talk more and are more interested in other human beings. And what we can start to do, now, and of course there's huge variation, but the point is we can start to get a sense of when people are more object-focused because they're paying attention to those things and concrete things versus when they're paying attention to other human beings. Now, this is the basic idea of what led me to this world that I want to tell you about. And I want to do a very quick overview of some of the studies that we've been doing, trying to get a sense of how we can begin to understand language and how it tells us about people. One of the very first studies I did was to look at poets, and specifically focusing on suicidal versus non-suicidal poets. Now, many of you may know that the most dangerous occupation probably in the world, well, certainly in the United States, is being a published poet. Some of the research suggests that as many as 25% of them commit suicide. Now, can you identify suicidal from non-suicidal poets by looking at their poetry, by analyzing their poetry? Well, we did just this project. And you probably would guess, as I did, was that suicidal poets undoubtedly use more negative emotion words, more references to death. Well, it turns out you and I both would be wrong on that. It turns out all poets are kind of depressed, so I believe that's in the job description. The biggest difference is their use of the word I. Suicidal poets use the word I much more than non-suicidal poets. This is also true in terms of depression. When people are depressed, they use I words more than people who are not depressed. And among people, when we track people's emails, when they are going through depressive episodes versus not, during the depressive episodes, they use the word I more than when they're not depressed. Again, it's getting at this idea of self-focus. And in fact, one theory of depression is that it's a disease of self-focus. Another thing that we've been interested in is looking at honesty. Is there a difference between people who are being honest versus being deceptive? And we've done numbers of studies on this, as now have many other labs. In fact, there was just a small conference where there were about 40 people who came to it who have done studies with language and depression, or honesty and dishonesty. And what you find is that if you are interviewing someone and they are being deceptive, and if you induce them to be deceptive versus not, you get fairly consistent differences between honesty and dishonesty. And when people are being honest, they tend to use the word I more. That is, when you're being honest, you are more self-focused. You're more personal. You are owning what you're saying more. And when you're being deceptive, you are psychologically pushing this concept away from self. The other dimension that is interesting, there are actually two other dimensions. One of them is a group of words that we call exclusive words. These are kind of prepositions and conjunctions. Words like except, but, exclude, words such as that, where people are making a distinction between what is in a category and what is not in a category. And when people are lying, when people tell them the truth, or when people tell them the truth, they say, if I ask you, what did you do last night? You're likely to say, well, last night, let's see, I was going to a particular restaurant, but then the line was too long, so instead I did this, and then I realized I left my keys in the. You're saying what you did and what you didn't do. And that's what a truth teller does. For liars, that is incredibly complex, because you actually didn't go anywhere last night, and having to say what you didn't not do is beyond, it's just too complex. And the other thing is when people are telling the truth, they tend to be more specific. They use more articles and prepositions, and some other things as well. But the point is that this group of words begin to tell us about how people are thinking and how they are putting stories together. Now, one of the directions that we've been playing with recently is one that I particularly loved, and this is trying to get at thinking styles. Now, there are a number of bodies behind me that have looked at thinking styles, trying different strategies, and it's a killer problem because thinking styles, almost all thinking style research, is based on self-reports, asking, so tell me how you think. Do you think this way? Do you think that way? And it's a good start, but wouldn't it be nice to get a more objective marker of thinking style? Well, a few years ago, I talked with our admissions office to see if I could get access to admissions essays of students who had been admitted to the university. And the University of Texas has a large number of students. And we got 4 years of data, so these are about 25,000 students, and each person wrote 2 essays, so we had access to 50,000 admissions essays. And what we did is to go through and analyze these admissions essays. And before I got into it deeply, I thought, it'd be important to do some basic psychometrics. How do these 8 dimensions of function words co-vary? And it turns out it's one single factor. And it's a nice coherent single factor. And it's so simple, it's almost embarrassing, but imagine a continuum. At this end of the continuum is what I'm going to call analytic thinking, and it's associated with high use of articles and prepositions and low use of pronouns, auxiliary verbs, conjunctions, negations, selected adverbs. And at this end, it's just the opposite. Low use of articles and prepositions, high use of pronouns, auxiliary verbs, etc. If you go in, you pull out the top 10 essays of the people who are high in these articles and prepositions, one and the other. Here's what their essay sounds like. I want to come to the University of Texas and major in psychology because there are 3 important features of the university's program. Blah, 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 blah. It's a nice, straight, formal, analytic kind of deal. Go pick out the bottom 10, or the top 10 at the other end. I want to major in psychology because when I was 4 years old, my family moved from this place to this place, and I started to realize that I wanted to do better than that. So at one end is analytic thinking, and the other is what I'm calling narrative thinking. And it's striking how different they are. The narrative thinking is very much here and now, short words, really, and often really good stories. And at this end is formal, logical kind of thinking. Now, we now correlate this score, because it's a simple analytic score that we compute. And what we find is it correlates 0.2 with 4-year grade point average. such that the more analytic the essay is, the better they do in college. And it doesn't matter if these students go into architecture, fine arts, engineering, physics, psychology, it makes no difference. It doesn't matter if they're black or white, rich or poor, you get the same slope in everything. The more analytic somebody is, the better they do in college. Now, so this is one of the dimensions we're starting to play with because it also raises some interesting questions. Can you train people to think analytically? And we've been playing with this idea, which is telling people, okay, I want you to write about this topic. Use lots of articles and prepositions. Or, interestingly, along this dimension, articles and prepositions are really stand-in for nouns. It turns out, this is the weirdest thing in the world. By the way, if my high school English teacher knew I cared about parts of speech, she would know it couldn't possibly be true. It's essentially nouns versus verbs. And it turns out, nouns and verbs correlate about a -0.6. And in this room, there's some nouners and there are people who are into verbing. And so this dimension of analytic versus narrative thinking is in some ways essentially identifying nouns versus verbs. And so one of our questions is, if we ask students to describe something but to use lots of nouns versus lots of verbs, does it change them? And I can't answer that question yet. This is one thing that we're playing with right now. Now, language, the whole purpose of language is to communicate. It's social. What can we learn about social relationships by looking at language? And this has been one of the topics that I've been particularly interested in the last couple of years. The first is, actually more than the last couple of years. One thing is status. So we've done a number of studies where we bring people to the laboratory, and initially we just said, okay, you two just talk to one another. No purpose to it. And at the end, we would ask each of the two people, who had this higher status of the two of you? You know, people agree at fairly high rates who has the higher status. Or we would do this over a place where you couldn't see the other person, they'd be typing somebody else. Or we got a lot of people to give us their emails, outgoing and incoming emails for a small number of interactions, and they would rate who had the higher status. One thing that comes out incredibly strong is that we can tell status by looking at the relative use of the word I. And it goes against what you would have thought before you came in. The people who use the word I more are lower status. And the people who use the word I less are higher status. High status people do not use I much. And by the way, I looked at my own data and with emails. And go and check yours and you'll find this is a really robust effect. So for example, an undergraduate student will write me, "Dear Dr. Pennebaker, I am so-and-so, and I was wondering if I could talk with you because I think I have a good idea." And I write back, "Dear student, thank you so much for your email. How about next Tuesday?" "Dear Dean, I am Jamie Pennebaker, and I would like to talk to you about this idea." "Dear Jamie, thank you so much for your email." Now, what's interesting about this is nobody's putting anybody down. This is the language of power, that we talk differently to high status people than we do to low status people, and it's often completely appropriate. And very often when I give talks about this, people will come up afterward and say, "Oh man, now that I know about this, I'm never going to be using I when I talk to people." And it's fascinating. It's kind of like, you don't get it, do you? That in fact, it's appropriate to use I when you're talking to higher status versus lower status. And what's so wonderful about this? We all do it. And I dare say virtually nobody here has ever been aware of it. Now you're screwed. You're going to be aware of it. We've also been looking at other kinds of social relationships. One is something that we call language style matching. Looking at the degree to which two people or more people are connected with each other when they're talking. And what this is just calculating the percentage of words, such as pronouns, prepositions, articles, etc., how similar they are in any two texts or in an interaction between two people. And what we find is that we come up with this, what we call an LSM metric, which goes from 0 to 1.0. What we're able to do with this is start to predict the degree to which two people are essentially on the same page. They're talking alike. They're mimicking one another, if you like. And what's fascinating about this LSM is that we can use this to look at a couple of studies by Molly Ireland are two of my favorites. One of them is looking at speed dates. And speed dates, for those of you, speed dates, I should tell you, are the most wonderful thing on earth. Not for me personally, but as a scientist. Because here you have all of these conversations, and you have lots of data. And what we were able to do is get some data from other labs that had done these speed dates. And what we found was by analyzing the language, we did a better job at predicting who'd go on a subsequent date than the people themselves. Which, is that, and you're asking how's that possible? Well, the reason is very often one person wants to go on a date, but the other one doesn't. What LSM does is it does a good job in predicting if the two of them are on the same page. Another project was one that one of my students, Rich Slasher, had done earlier with young dating couples. These are by and large freshmen. And to be in our study, the couple had to use instant messaging with each other daily. And they had to give us 10 days of instant messaging. And what we did was we got these 10 days, and we used that to predict if they'd still be together several months later. And what we found was LSM did a remarkable job at predicting if they'd still be together. Those who were, these were 86 couples, those who were above average in LSM, in the top half, 80% were still together 3 months later. Those in the bottom half, only 52% were still together 3 months later. And what's interesting about this, it's not exactly magic. I should point out, there was absolutely no relationship between self-report of the relationship and whether they thought they'd still be together, quality of relationship, and if they survived 3 months later. But you can read these, and you can see this relationship is going nowhere. But they themselves didn't see it, which is, you know, as a psychologist, you can't help but just get teary-eyed, you know, with this kind of data. Now, where we're going with this is we come up with systems so that we can get small groups. I've become quite interested in small group behavior. Looking at how a group of, say, 5 people who are working together on a task, how they're connecting with one another. And what we're able to do is to get our computer program to essentially monitor a group. Now, they're all typing, so this is all virtual. And they're working together, and the computer analyzes the data maybe every 2 minutes, and it can give the group feedback. So one thing we can do is we can say, we can first of all do simple things like if someone's talking too much. So if someone is using 40% of the words, and there's 5 in the group in the last few minutes, you can give a private message to that guy saying, hey, you know, in the last few minutes you've said 40% of the words, you should have said 20%. Why don't you stand back and try to encourage others to talk? We also can come up with metrics of, are you staying on task? And this is a really easy one. There's some certain key words you can do because you know what the task is. But when people are on task, they use more articles of preposition. And we can tell the group, you know, you're straying off task. And when they stray off task, it's almost always something social. And then we can use LSM, the language style matching, which is if they are not paying attention to each other, their LSM drops. And we can tell the group, okay, you all aren't paying attention to each other. Try to listen more closely to others. And what's interesting is with our feedback system, it works. The people do change. They do start talking more equitably. They start paying attention to each other. They start to stay on task more. And we've been using this in I teach a giant introductory psychology class. This is an online class with Sam Gosling. And we teach it like a television show. And we have a studio audience of about 20 students, and then we broadcast out to about 1,500, and hopefully bigger groups in the future. And every day we're able to break the class into groups of 5 and do these little group experiments essentially every day, trying to find out how we can bring about changes in social behaviors, social engagement, and also performance on subsequent exams. The irony is, we're able to change, right now we're able to change the dynamics of the group, but it doesn't make them learn anymore. So this is kind of one of our next big projects. So what I've done is, what I've done and what I'm trying to do is trying to start to get a sense of how we can use words to learn about us. Now, what I've told you is really kind of the base of the work I'm doing. This last summer I worked at Microsoft and I started to get into search terms. So these are the terms on your computer which, do me a favor and never erase your search terms because they are the key to who you are. And what we're finding is really interesting with my research team. 2 or 3 years ago, I said, you won't mind if I analyze your email? I'll not look at it and so forth. And they go, well, okay. And then last year I said, do you mind if I analyze your search terms? I won't look at it. And they all said, are you kidding? Isn't it interesting about search terms? Because they really reflect who we are and often who we don't want anybody else to know who we are. And so we're starting to use, and search terms now are being used by, many of you know about the Google work in terms of using that to identify disease and disease outbreaks. But they are incredible in terms of looking at disasters, what people search for immediately, where you are, how you're thinking. We also do a lot of work with Twitter, with all these other things. And some of the work that Mortiza and others are doing here is very much in line with many of the same questions we're asking, because whatever the text is, whether we're looking at the individual level, the couple level, the group of 5 level, we can also start looking at this at a much broader level, looking at a cultural level, a community level, etc. So I could talk for many hours on this work, but instead of continuing for many hours, probably going to stop and open this up for questions. Questions? Yes?
Can you say something more about the search term? What do you mean by search?
A search term. So think about when you were on the computer lab and you wanted to know something. So is Beyonce really dating so-and-so? I think I saw you ask that. There's 2 features of this. One are function words, because now people are using search almost as though it's a person. Kind of like many of you are using Siri this way. Hey Siri! That's a cheap thing for me to do. So all of your phones are just lighting up. But you can talk to Siri and ask a question, or these other systems. And so we can get a sense of personality. But everybody looks for different things. And we're finding these fascinating deals. So we'll find some people, most people's searches are habitual. So some people in this room, I happen to know, search for car stuff all the time. Some of you search for furniture, and there's a lot of you looking at porn. But the fact is the kind of things we search for tell us about who you are as a person. And then we can also use it to get a sense of your life. For example, we being the Microsoft and Google and so forth, we know if you start searching for realtor, there's a very good chance that in 3-4 months you're going to be searching for irrigation equipment. The fact that we can start to get a sense of how things are changing. Or when you start searching for, divorce attorney. And, we can also, a few months later, you're going to be therapy. But we can start to get a sense of events in people's lives as they unfold, because once you have a really large data set, you can line it all up and get everyone who's searched for something, for example, divorce attorney on this day, and track that entire group. How do you get this data? Microsoft and Google have it, but there are also companies that actually collect this data, and what they do is some of you might even be part of some of these, where they'll contact you and say, let us look at your search terms, and we'll give you the opportunity to win big prizes or something like that. And millions of people do that. So that's one of my search terms. Yes?
So, do you have a measure of self-deception? And this can relate also with how
So,
deceive others.
right, so a measure of self-deception, there's a wonderful book that Robert Trivers published a few years ago that looked at the nature of deception and self-deception. His argument was that they're the same, that to be deceptive, you have to be self-deceptive. And it makes good sense. With our newest version of Luke, we have a dimension that we call authenticity. It's based on our deception research. And what it is when someone's being self-deceptive, they're not self-focused. So I words, almost by definition, will be lower, and certain other things will be different as well. The killer problem is always this, and that is, what is the gold standard for self-deception? You know, we as a friend of somebody, we can say that person is being self-deceptive, but there's not, you know, here's a questionnaire. Is self-deceptive, to what degree are you self-deceptive? But I think that the algorithms for other deception would be as good as you could do. Yes?
I was just wondering if you combine some of these things. Like, so what happens if a high status person does use lots of I words?
So if a high status person uses lots of I words.
Like Donald Trump.
Well, Donald, actually I've done lots of analyses of the candidates. And actually, with one of my graduate students, Kayla Jordan, we have a WordPress blog called Word Watchers that does this. He does use I words at a pretty high rate, and I think it probably reflects insecurity. You know, he's in a domain he's never been in, and it's interesting looking at which presidents have used I the most. And the ones that used I the most, as I recall, at least in terms of their press conferences, are Truman, Bush 1, and I think those are the two. And the ones who use I the least generally is associated with self-confidence, sometimes arrogance. Obama is the lowest I user of all modern presidents, which is kind of interesting because presidential watchers have always said that he is the most, from the very first day, he was so confident that they hadn't seen anybody like that. And it's interesting with the candidates. I love this race right now. Yes, okay, the choices might suck for all of us, but if you're studying words, you could never do better because it's like a rainbow of language. And the two extremes in the Republicans are Trump and Cruz. They are at the absolute opposite ends. And so, for example, I words they're not huge between them, but what is big is what is analytic thinking. And analytic thinking, I told you, is associated with doing well in college and so forth. It's also correlated with SAT. You know, I think it's a marker of raw intelligence, but also formal analytic thinking. Cruz is the highest of all candidates. And the second highest, I think, is Hillary, but he's still much, much higher than anybody else. Trump is down here. And if you start listening to him, you have never heard him say anything logical or by that I mean analytic. He doesn't break down problems in terms of if, then, or any kind of complexity. Cruz does. Now there's another dimension, which is one of my favorites, which we're now called this cognitive process variable. This includes insight, cause, effect, and so forth. These dimensions they've got great psychometrics. Being high on this suggests it's associated with people working through problems. If I ask you to tell me what is the relationship between, so how does this microphone work in terms of the underlying electronics of it? Some of you know, most of you have some vague sense. If you had some vague sense, you're actually going to use lots of working through words. Well, I think, I believe, I wonder, da-da-da-da. If you knew how it worked, you would say, this is related to da-da-da-da-da, and you would not use any cognitive process words. So what we can now do is go and look at these, our various candidates. Because if they're using cognitive process words at high rates, they are working through the topic while they're talking about it. And if they don't use these, they know truth. Who knows truth? Cruz knows truth. He doesn't use these words much at all. And Trump is as high as everybody else. One other person is low, but not as low as Cruz, and that is Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders also knows truth. He has a scheme by which to organize the world, just as Cruz does. So they're both actually low in these cognitive process words. Yeah.
So this is they perceive that they know the truth.
I'm sorry?
This is they perceive.
It's perceived truth. Yeah. There is no truth in this world. Yes.
I'm interested in the difference between analytical thinking and narrative thinking and trauma and rewriting narrative. And I'm curious to what extent in law school they say that they retrain your writing to be this analytical process. But then in film school, we're trained to be storytellers and narrative thinkers. So, technically speaking, we may be getting closer and closer to doing poorly in school. But I'm curious though, because in the process of working through trauma, this is also a process of creating a narrative, a new narrative. To what extent does this relate to literature? What are your thoughts?
Well, that's a great question. I have the data to analyze it, but I've not looked at it yet. I would almost think, and again, my intuition is that the people who benefit will do analytic thinking some and storytelling some. And think of how therapy works. Therapy, there's kind of both of these, that you tell the story and then there's analysis, tell more story and then analysis. And that's my gut sense about it. By the way, we're doing some work on narrative, which is, I'm so excited by this. What we've been doing is going through thousands of books, zillions of blogs, and any other kind of text you can imagine, and breaking them into 5 equal parts, and then doing a Luke analysis to see how language changes over different types of narrative. And what we find is across narratives, even telephone calls using the switchboard corpus, for those who know it, and also chat groups in our class, there are certain rules for all narratives, which is at the beginning people use lots of analytic thinking that drops, and narrative thinking goes up. There are cognitive words, working through is a curvilinear relationship. Emotion words, both positive and negative emotion words tend to go up over time. But what's interesting is that all these narratives share very similar features. And we've been looking at it in our groups in our class, because we have so many groups. And what we're finding is if a chat follows this same general pattern, those students do better on the next quiz. Almost as though that they naturally are figuring out, it's almost that they're constructing a story about what they're talking about. In any case, it's just another way for us to start thinking about words and language. Any other questions? Yes?
What is the relationship between how someone expresses him or herself in writing compared to spoken words? We have lots of data on spoken versus written and writing across context. It's always positively correlated. And so first of all, it's important to appreciate context is associated with major word changes. So in a formal context, you use lots more articles and prepositions. In a really informal one, you use more pronouns and fewer articles. But a high pronoun user in one context, if you're the highest of a group in one context, you'll be the highest in another context, even though your means will be much lower. So that's generally what we find. Yes?
Last question.
Was it me again?
Yes.
When you talk about the cognitive mechanisms category in the book, clearly a lot of work has been directed towards acquisition and set categories with expressive writing work and so forth. But there are other categories, discrepancy, inhibition, and so forth. And I'm just wondering, a lot of the times people talk about cognitive
research that you have done with regards to these other categories, where they might be potent? Because I feel they not received
So you're,
institutional attention.
this is actually a really important question. You have to understand, I don't know if there are any linguists here, and if they are, they probably have left. Because what I'm doing breaks all the rules of linguistics, because I don't care about language. I'm interested in people and using these as predictors. But keep in mind, these are horribly, horribly, horribly crude predictors. It's like fMRI. It's horribly, horribly crude where we are right now. We're doing a lot better than any of us would have thought 20 years ago. But you have to understand there's so much noise in the system. You know, I'm telling you that the correlation between the language I'm looking at and grade point average several years later is 0.2. I think that's the most amazing thing I've ever found. But I tell other people, they go, 0.2, geez, that's the saddest thing I've ever heard. This is your life? And the same thing is true with the expressive writing. The killer problems, expressive writing studies have always been involved, you know, with maybe 40 subjects, maybe 50, not very many. And language is highly variable. And so what is really needed are studies with tens of thousands of people before we can really start to get a strong handle. And given the dirt that we're dealing with, the effect sizes are still going to be very modest. So my recommendation is, if this is something you're interested in, start working. So there are corpora around that you could analyze that you could actually start trying to figure this out. I can point you to some, Orteza can, other people can, but we don't know the answer.